Good afternoon and welcome to this Bright Blue event, Local Ties Building Better, Happier Workforces in Key Public Services, in partnership with Unions 21. I'm Phoebe Arslanagić-Wakefield, Senior Researcher at Bright Blue, which is an independent Liberal Conservative think tank. For those who are tweeting, please use the handle @WeAreBrightBlue and the hashtag BrightBlue. While posing a tremendous challenge and forcing such services to find new ways of working and reaching the people who need and rely on them the most. The COVID-19 pandemic has also clearly and indisputably demonstrated the crucial value of public services that support and underpin our lives. Now, as we're beginning to emerge from the pandemic with a new understanding of the importance of these services to communities, how can we improve recruitment and retention in these services? And is this a question that has received enough policy focus in recent years? Are salary increases the answer, or are there other policy tools that can be put to work here? At the same time, how can we especially retain key workers in public services that serve left behind communities? And should that actually be part of the government's levelling up agenda? Here today to answer and discuss these and more questions, we have our panellists, who I will very shortly introduce, and then who will each give a 5-minute speech on building better, happier workforces in key public services. Afterwards, I'll get the discussion going, and then you'll be able to pose your questions to the panellists. If you are watching us from home via the live stream, then you can also put your questions to the panellists via the Slido link, which should be just on the bottom of the video using the code BRIGHTBLUE2. So today we are joined by Shaun Bailey, member of the Work and Pensions Committee, who represents West Bromwich West, David Skelton, author of the new Snobbery, Dean Rogers, Director of Industrial Strategy and Society at the College of Radiographers, and Paul Whiteman, General Secretary at the National Association of Head Teachers. Shaun, your 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Phoebe. Yes, it's great to be able to be here today and to discuss, I think, what is an incredibly important issue, and I think something that we've seen during the course of this pandemic, has highlighted the role of our key public sector services. And I think this is it's a difficult question to answer. It's a nuanced one. I think the first thing I would say off the bat is that it's a question that has probably years. We've seen the government's commitment to recruit more police officers. So there seems to be a political will there to do this. Now, clearly, from my perspective, particularly as a newly elected member of Parliament in what would be described perhaps as a left-behind area, is how that delivery looks like, because that's going to be the big thing that we're judged on this. It's not about the words that are put out there, the promises that are made, but it's actually the on-the-ground delivery. So really, I think the key point that I would hope to explore today perhaps is how do we deliver on what we've seen so far? What are the key factors in that delivery? And more broadly, perhaps, what are the nuanced answers that perhaps we don't necessarily see? Is it all necessarily just about funding, money, or are there other elements to it as well? Now, my view is I think there is a balance to be struck between, yes, of course, the fiscal interventions that are needed, more investment, incentivising people to join our key public sector services, but also quality of life, ensuring people have communities where they can make their home, ensuring that in areas like mine, where we need these professionals, these people to be working, we need these services, there is an incentive to be there to do that, because it's all well and good having these services from afar, but actually we need them in these communities. So for me also, I suppose the big thing is how we ensure that this spread of investment, of recruitment, is done in a way that is fair and that represents areas such as mine, which perhaps have been ignored for too long. But clearly I think it's going to be interesting to hear all the views that we've got today and how that sort of pans out. And I'm really interested to see what sort of the other panellists have got to say. But as I say, I think for me, it's quite a nuanced response in terms of how we deal with this. And I think it's going to have a lot of factors that are involved with it. And I think as well, I'm quite lucky as a backbencher to be able to sort of scrutinise the government in that way and put the cosh on when I need to. Because I think that's going to be a big part of ensuring that we follow through on this and that we meet those key pledges that we've made around increasing involvement in the public sector. So that's probably going to conclude my comments so far, to keep it short and sweet. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaun. David, your 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Do I need to go?
No, it's fine.
That's fine. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Congratulations to Bright Blue for the consistently excellent work that you put out as well. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted that issues like levelling up, better wages, stronger communities are dominating the Tory Party conference. Because I remember a Tory Party conference, it was quite lonely being a Tory who was pushing for things like higher minimum wage. I was doing it, Bright Blue were doing it, and I remember the one senior Tory who was also doing it was Boris Johnson. He was really pushing for higher living wage and was delivering on that in London. So this agenda hasn't come out of nowhere. It's something the Prime Minister has consistently pushed for, and I think that's important and shouldn't be forgotten. I also remember 10 years ago giving an interview in which I said that my hometown of Consett, a left-behind place, former steelworking town, would one day have a Tory MP, and I remember the journalist actually laughed. The MP for Consett will hopefully be here in a few minutes, sitting to my right hand side, Rick Holden. So that just shows how things have changed in these 10 years. And I think the questions that are posed by Bright Blue in this session today are hugely important. And I think that levelling up has the potential to be the most important public policy agenda for decades and deliver some of those profound differences to quality of life for decades. And I think the point Shaun made that improving public services and public service retention in left-behind communities goes hand in hand with the rest of the levelling up agenda. So making sure people have a good place to live, decent town centres, good local infrastructure in terms of transport and in terms of things like digital broadband, this kind of thing. And good quality local jobs, making sure that places are great places to live. Salaries also matter. I think you particularly need to encourage the best teachers to go into those places that need it the most. And having that kind of flexibility to incentivise the best teachers to relocate there is, I think, really important. And I think it's also crucial to put public sector workers, wherever possible, at the heart of how public services are delivered. Give autonomy to public sector workers, give power to public sector workers in terms of how delivery happens. That includes within schools, but also I think it's important that several left-behind towns, post-industrial towns, hopefully re-industrialised towns in a few years, become the centre of a revived form of technical and vocational education. And I think putting public sector workers in alliance with unions and businesses at the centre of what that technical and vocational education looks like is a really good example of how you can really empower public sector workers in this delivery. And I think just finally, it's important, I think we've seen over the course of the pandemic how particularly low-paid workers are more at risk in terms of the economic risk and the medical risk of COVID. So just making sure that everybody has dignity at work, everybody has power at work is really important, whether they're public sector workers or private sector workers. And I think the ability to be represented at work, to be able to organise at work and be members of the trade union is really important there as well. And I even make the case in the book for sectoral bargaining and in some cases for low-paid workers who've been consistently held back there. So as I say, I think the levelling up agenda for me could make a really profound difference to communities that have been long forgotten. And I'm really proud that this has been taken up so emphatically by the Prime Minister this week. I think it's just a case of making it happen and empowering people and delivering better quality of life for people. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, David. Ian, your 5 minutes, please.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you actually need to move them around, apparently. It's all up.
Okay, right, okay. So, good afternoon, and thanks for taking the time to come and listen to us. And I want to use the short time I've got to amplify the scale and urgency, really, of the recruitment and retention crisis in our public services, with particular emphasis from the NHS. I also want to give some explanations as to why that's the case, and I think these signpost the way out of the crisis. And then I want to give some advice, because that's what unions do, of what to do, what not to do, and also a couple of ideas to try, if I can fit those into the 5 minutes. So while since 2000, Shaun was saying, the public sector jobs have shrunk as a share of employment as a whole, the headline behind that is a much more complex picture. And economically, the public sector is increasingly vital in every community. 25% of the total workforce in Northern Ireland, 23% in Yorkshire and the North East, 21% in Wales and Scotland, 17% here in the North West work in the public sector. In the South West, the NHS workforce is the equivalent of the entire population of Exeter. And these are good, well-paid, stable jobs, the type of jobs in those communities that local kids can aspire to have. This is especially true in the NHS, which has bucked the general public sector trend. And according to the last ONS survey, 1.78 million people now work in the NHS. That's almost 1 in 3 of the public sector workforce, and 5.4% of the total workforce of the UK alone working in the NHS, and it's going to need to grow further. So the NHS is important economically, but it's also important psychologically. Knowing the NHS is there for you when you need it increases the personal security, energy and morale of the whole community. And this is a large part of the reason why this party did so well in so many northern seats in the last election. Because voters' experience had shown them that the NHS wasn't there for them when they needed it, and Labour in particular was sanctifying the NHS as if its only problem was a risk of privatisation. So can the NHS and the public sector solve regional disparities? What I would say is, if you get this wrong, you'll make it worse. The answers are not about releasing more competition into the system, and it's time to park your dogmas on all sides and listen to those of us who work in the services. By starting with understanding the scale and the reasons for the problem, we start to see a way of solving it. And these are deeply entrenched systematic problems which can't be solved with quick and easy solutions. We need to be serious, long-term strategic approach and a long-term commitment. So what are the 2 big challenges? 2 big challenges: we need more people and we need to stop them leaving, the staff that are already there. If you take right across all of the NHS professions, before the Ockenden report was coming out, midwives identified 8 out of 10 of them said they weren't enough to deliver a safe service. The physiotherapists have said that 80% are regularly working unpaid overtime. Radiography, the shortages are alarming and scary. We need to win in global competition for staff in short supply everywhere. We need to end the hostile environment to overseas recruitment, expand pathways into an exciting new profession through apprenticeships, creative training pathways, earn-to-train schemes, and we need to do so without compromising standards. We also need to stop people leaving, as I was saying. The scale of the crisis in radiography is probably more acute than anywhere else in the NHS, partly because of the way that radiography has been expanding. 9 out of 10 people will now encounter a radiographer in their NHS pathway. In 2018-19, conducted 43 million scans. If I trained as a radiographer, most of what I did as a professional wouldn't have been invented when I trained in the late 80s, early 90s. The forecasts for demand are for an extra 30% increase in the number of registered radiographers by 2030. And the Richards report recently identified that we're 33rd in the world in CT scans, 35th in the world in MRI scanners. That's the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, way down those league tables. And we need a 77% increase in the number of CT scanners to be able to match the OECD average for per population. There were 40,000 people waiting 6 weeks or more for a scan before COVID, a 4-fold increase since 2014. We need somewhere in the region of a 30% increase in staff by 2030. That's a serious strategic long-term problem that you can't solve with quick solutions. So how do you tackle the crisis? So you start by stopping people leaving. This means learning from mistakes and not doing anything stupid in the short term. Consider the public sector staffing impact on all policy initiatives and risk assess them with the question, will this make things worse in the short term and the problems more difficult? Pay isn't everything, but it is important economically to professionals, particularly in recruitment, and to their communities. It's also a symbol of how much they're valued by society. The IDS recently found average graduate pay starting at £27,475. An NHS professional starts on 9.3% less. Again, the CSP recently found 66%, or 2 out of 3, of their members were saying they were dissatisfied with pay. In podiatry, there's a 12% fall in the number of podiatrists employed in the NHS because they can't compete with the private sector, because the private sector have captured the market, because there's no strategy for pay and workforce planning across the NHS. So a 1% pay offer, or a 1% statement that 1% was going to be enough, all that we could afford, was an insult. The 3% has now already gone in national insurance increases, parking charges and general inflation. Our demand was for the NHS staff to get £2,000 flat increase. That would have cost 1/6 of the excess markup that the NAO have found that was identified for overpaying PPE, which Matt Hancock started at the start of the crisis when he said that we had enough PPE, it was just all in the wrong places. Next year's pay award will be critical, and a proposed pension increase for NHS workers must not happen. If that happens, you won't even get to the starting line in this race. Secondly, be strategic. The crisis has been fueled by short-termism and a lack of strategic coordination. The barriers to working, you need to work out how many people you need where and match that to where you're funding the jobs. For a quick example, 5 years ago, they worked out in Northern Ireland they needed more therapeutic radiographers. They increased the number of student places, but they didn't give the money to the trusts to fund them upon graduating. So on all of those graduates graduated last year, there were no therapeutic radiographer jobs being advertised, and they all had to leave for the mainland. That's nuts. That's the kind of strategic thing we're talking about. So be honest is the third point. Take the politics out of the narrative. At the moment, we're hearing a lot about investment and clearing the backlog. Our members are living in fear of those backlogs. They're already working 60-hour weeks. They're exhausted. The select committees have identified the burnout. They're looking at opening those floodgates, saying, well, you've been protecting the NHS for 12 months. This has all been about protecting the NHS, and now at the end of the crisis, you're going to open the floodgates and drown us all. So that has to stop. And lastly, I think increase and recognise the value of public sector workers as well as on pay. So ideas, just 3 quick ideas I'll just give you the headlines of, and you can ask me more about in questions because the time's running out, I think. One, look at this as a global market. If we're competing for radiographers across the world, what's the relocation and recruitment packages that the NHS can offer compared to the private sector competing for people with similar skills? We don't have a package. That's an area we can look at. Look at pension breaks, for example. In other countries, we would see if you want to go and work in a hard-pressed area where we can't recruit, like Shaun's or like Concert, look at a pension break for new graduates rather than a pension increase. And lastly, look at some creative plans with organisations like us. We've developed a green transport plan looks to combine interest-free loans and sponsored discounts for NHS staff purchasing electric cars with government and councils supporting hospitals with funding park and ride and shuttle bus schemes. Get on board and get behind and work with us on some of those plans. Those kind of softer benefits are relatively cost-effective, and their targeted nature send a huge message to both society and public servants that they're valued and that society cares about our carers. And that's really the start of this answer.
Thank you, Dean. We've been joined by Richard Holden MP. Welcome, Richard. But before we come to you, can we get your 5 minutes, please, Paul?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Paul Whiteman. I'm General Secretary of the NAHT. We represent about 35,000 serving school leaders, for those of you who don't know who we are. So we represent those managers in the education system that have to implement government policy and have to make government policy work. The implication in the question was not to just focus on how much money we need and asking for more money. So can we just take it as read that as a trade union general secretary, I'm never going to be embarrassed to ask for more money and more resources. But I will talk a little bit about money, but I want to concentrate on some other things as well. And I think we need to, first of all, establish that we do have a crisis in recruitment and retention into public services. And Dean's just given us some statistics there. In education, we're not recruiting enough graduates into the system, and we're not holding on to enough people into the system either. Far too few teachers want to stay in the system, and far too few leaders want to stay with us either. Now, you would think that education would be a safe haven profession during really difficult economic times, and that's shown through again in the year 2020, when for the first time in 7 years, we got to our recruitment target for graduates. First time in 7 years, we got to our recruitment target for graduates. That was during the middle of the pandemic and when we were facing or beginning to think about how bad an economic climate we might have. This year, we're 3.25% down on that number in terms of primary school teachers, and we're 7% down in terms of secondary school teachers. So even as we're just still beginning to understand the economic impact, a safe haven profession like teaching isn't attractive as it should be. We surveyed our members recently. Almost half of our members in middle leadership positions don't see themselves as ever stepping up into a more senior position. And about half of our head teacher members tell us that they're considering leaving the profession early because of the pressures that they're under. So we're not recruiting enough and we're not retaining enough either. So I said I'd talk a little bit about money, so let's talk about pay just very quickly. But it is about more than just pay. But in common with other public services, we rely on an independent pay review body to set our pay rates going forward, and those pay review bodies are constrained at the start in their work, and then for 2 years running our Secretary of State hasn't followed their recommendations either. So the idea of an independent review body to set it and to move us away from industrial strife has not acted on those recommendations. So the review body that we work with is talking about the absence of a pay uplift this year is going to have a tremendous impact on recruitment and retention again going forward. And I think that's really important when you don't listen to independent review bodies that are designed to make sure that we react in the right way and we don't get into some of the difficulties that we might otherwise face. The pay restraint for this year, the no pay to teachers, so teachers aren't getting anything this year apart from some very, very low paid ones, is justified on the basis that there will be pay restraint in the private sector because of COVID. What we now know is that wages moved by about 10% in the private sector last year, and they haven't moved the same in the public sector, and they're not moving at all in education. So that justification, although obvious at the time, hasn't come through in the numbers either. But it's more than that, and I want to just talk about more than that, because pay is a big issue. It's certainly a big issue for graduates, but as you get into the grades that I represent, comparatively to average earnings, they're managers, they're professionals, they're earning some of the better wages in public service. But their reputation and the standing of the profession has been in decline for at least a decade. And if you look at the narrative during lockdown about teachers sitting in their back gardens drinking Prosecco, doing nothing, which was the kind of narrative that we saw in some of the press, which was not true then and it's not true now. Simply doesn't attract people to want to work in a profession that actually was feeding the hungry, looking after the most vulnerable, keeping the children of key workers safe so key public services could continue, and reinventing education overnight with home learning, which no one had been taught to do. We had no plan for that and no facilities for it either. And our Secretary of State at the time invited parents who were nervous about the standard of home learning to write to the inspector at Ofsted to complain if they weren't happy. And I'm really pleased that Ofsted got 13,000 letters of compliment and 300 letters of complaint in response to that invitation, because parents and families understand the job that educators were doing. But even before the pandemic, the average working day for a teacher is about 12 hours long. And they take about half the holidays that everybody thinks that they take, because they're in for the other half of the holidays, making sure that they're ready for the next term and making sure that books and everything else are dealt with. And then we have a perverse high-stakes accountability system in education that really mitigates against the use of professionalism, against innovation, and against people going to the very hardest areas where we need the very best teachers, because your career, even if you're the best, is in peril if you're not supported properly in a really difficult area. And then the lack of support services. So I'm not just going to argue for more in education, but what we also saw during the pandemic was a reliance on schools to be the last physical representation of the state in many communities, when you couldn't get hold of referrals to mental health services and health services, and you couldn't get through to social services either, because they've been so blighted and so restricted as well. So we need the brightest and the best for solutions now and in the long term. I'm running out of time, but on all of the questions really quickly, Should government be involved in solving the recruitment and retention crisis? Who else is going to do it in public services if it's not government? And we need to do it for the longer term as we stand increasingly alone in the world. I'll stop there and hopefully pick up the rest on questions.
Thank you, Paul. Richard, your 5 minutes, please.
No, absolutely, thank you. I'm sorry I was late. I was just losing a football match against the lobby over at Manchester City's training ground, which was quite embarrassing for everyone, particularly how unfit we all are. It's also very kind to see that you made Shaun a member of the Privy Council, but I've not been given the same accolade, which is fair enough, I suppose. We can all see the direction of travel in that one. I just want to say a few things. First of all, I view all of... I've actually worked very closely with some of the unions in my constituency over the last few months. I'll go into one of those examples recently, but I think this entire approach to the public sector is absolutely crucial to the overall what we're trying to do with levelling up. I think obviously for somewhere like North West Durham, infrastructure is part of the levelling up agenda, so are jobs in the economy more broadly, but I think public services and public service delivery is a crucial part of that, and particularly in terms of, actually two of the panellists have spoken already today, around health and health inequalities, particularly in somewhere like North West Durham. There's some historic issues there, but I think also mental health issues are much higher than the national average. And in terms of teaching, it's a big issue that I get all the time is that recruitment and retention of staff. We have some very good universities in the North East, but people will come, maybe go into for a couple of years and then want to move on and go somewhere else, or go and do something else, which is, I think, the other thing that Paul just mentioned. The other, and I did want to pick up on one of the points that you just made, Paul, very briefly, around the pandemic. I know particularly in my own area, some of the head teachers they are the only trusted for some communities, their interaction with the state. Their other interactions with the state are always negative, and actually those interactions with head teachers were vitally important to ensuring that children were looked after during the pandemic as well as being educated. So there's a huge amount from my local head teachers, and they had some pushback from let's say more difficult unions as well, who weren't as helpful as perhaps they could have been. I would like to see better funding, but I think one of the big roles for unions here is actually, for me, is in the post-16 education environment. I think one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is a big concentration on increasing funding for primary and for secondary education. But we all know that it's actually the post-16 which has been most squeezed over the last few years. Part of that is actually the fact that there isn't probably as strong a union representation across the workforce. There isn't that push from the unions, probably working actually with politicians from all political parties in order to drive that. I remember when I was at school, it was always very much class sizes decreased. However, from 5 up to 18, and there's that cross-subsidisation from post-16 education into the other parts it's gone the other way around over the last few years. And I do think that there's a couple of things from my time in the Department of Education before that really stood out. One is it isn't all about pay. But I think that we have to get to that 30,000 starting salary for teachers, mainly because it puts teaching in the top level of professions, and I think that's crucially important. And secondly, in terms of grants versus cancelling student loans, when I was in the Department of Education, we looked at what was the more cost-effective alternative for the taxpayer, actually, and as to whether you could, and in terms of getting more graduate recruits in. And it was actually better. It would actually be better and more cost-effective for the taxpayer to cancel student loans rather than to do grants in a lot of situations. Certainly, maybe if somebody stays in for 5 years or 10 years, you could look at doing that. The Treasury pushed back on that because they thought they might have to do it in other areas. But I think that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world either. But I think that's something that certainly in terms of those broader things that I think unions could look at. I think also particularly that has a real effect around marginal rates of tax. That's something I've written on recently, and I think it particularly hits in certain places for head teachers, but also for senior nurses and doctors as well. Those pension tax reliefs just aren't there in the NHS. We've had real issues in my constituency when we're seeing doctors working 3 days rather than 5 days a week because they'll end up paying tax rates over 100%. We've seen the same issue with younger members of the workforce saying, maybe you're a teacher who's an assistant head looking to that head teacher role, but you lose, the amount of your marginal tax rates are just so high. So I think there's a broader thing to look at which cuts across both the public and private sector. But I suppose the final thing I really also think there is a place for unions in to build that better, happier workforce is in the care sector. I was in a part of my constituency recently. I've got an excellent domiciliary care provider who grew up from a small team of 3 people to 80 staff. They're really they are one of the outstanding providers, one of the top 3% in the country. I want to see them continue and thrive. But we really need that push for those people delivering a public service, but not via the public sector. I think there is a real need for some of those people to be as well represented as possible. And I think there's sometimes seen as a tension there between those employers, and some of them are bad employers, but they overwhelmingly are good employers, and certainly these guys in my constituency were, and the workforce. I think actually good employers will have a good workforce and will want to retain them at all costs. And I think there's probably better working that could be done there. But overall, I think there is an acute crisis in parts of the country. There's certainly a bigger issue in parts of the northeast in terms of recruitment for both NHS and other staff. I'll just leave finally with one concern that I have looking forwards, which is around the actual challenge around policing. We've got this extra 20,000 officers, but those extra 20,000 were starting on starting rates of pay. Over the next few years, they're going to be moving up their pay scales. So they're going to cost a lot more over the next few years. We need to look at how we can ensure that we don't end up in a cycle of losing experienced officers, equally losing experienced teachers or NHS professionals, in order that the numbers go up, but actually those years of experience are lost. And I think that's a really important part of that, what we need to look at overall as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Well, I've got a few questions of my own before we open up to the floor. David, there's been lots of focus on how we can recruit and hold on to doctors, nurses, teachers. That's often who we think of first when we think about recruitment crisis in public sector and the key workers that we really need. But are there groups of key workers who we're leaving out of the national conversation to some extent?
It's a good question. And I have to say, as the son of a comprehensive school teacher, I was kind of brought up knowing the value that teachers bring and the hard work teachers bring every week of the year, as was said before. So I think we should salute the work of all the public sector workers. And I think the point that Richard made about care workers is absolutely crucial. We've seen the centrality of care workers during the pandemic. We've seen how important they are, increasingly important with an ageing population, to so many communities and so many families. And I think it's crucial that care workers are, one, recruited, but two, have the right kind of dignity at work, the right kind of pride at work, and the right conditions. And that's partially a representation thing, that's partially making sure they are represented in the public discussion as well, which I think is hugely important. And I just reiterate the importance of incentivising the best teachers into those areas that need it the most. In the book, I did a lot of work, which I know Bright Blue have done as well, about the prevalence of schools which have lower Ofsted ratings in areas which are so-called left behind. And there's a number of factors about that. And obviously, as I say, you do have to improve the general conditions of towns, the general infrastructure, but you also have to incentivise people. And the idea of cancelling student loans, I think, is an interesting one. But also giving schools that flexibility to incentivise in a way that they see fit is quite important as well. In all of this, as I say, the importance of giving power to public sector workers and public sector bodies. So the man in Whitehall doesn't know best now. Didn't know best when Douglas J said it in the 1940s, certainly doesn't know best now. So there should be scope for local experimentation in this as well, and there needs to be scope for proper incentivisation to make sure that the areas that need great public sector workers are able to attract them and retain them.
Thank you, David. Shaun, David's spoken about incentivisation, especially perhaps local contacts. That's something you touched on as well. I mean, what sort of incentives would you like to see this government actively pursue?
Well, I don't think there's one specific answer you can give to that, isn't it? Because ultimately, if we're talking about the local context, it comes back to the point I made at the start, which is about marrying that hand in hand with the sort of the local outcomes and the local issues that present themselves in communities. And I think a respect for the fact that, my communities in Tipton, for example, maybe probably a bit different to Consett in as much as similar issues, but perhaps they present themselves in different ways. So I think the key for that, really, to answer that question, is marrying up the other parts of that levelling up agenda around quality housing, around people wanting to come to these areas, because I do think services and the people that deliver those services being physically present in the communities they're serving, it's so fundamental to that holistic approach in terms of actually being able to understand where the communities they're delivering these services to and being incentivised to be there. So it all marries up in terms of ensuring that if someone wants to make their life in a particular part of the country, they can do that. And I don't think these aren't siloed elements. They're not siloed at all. They're very much part of that broader discussion that we've been talking about. It's about ensuring that people have that quality of life, not just in their work life, but actually also outside of that as well, that incentivise them to come to these areas that we need them in. I think more broadly, I think the point on incentivising retention is really key as well. I mean, we see all these headline numbers about how many we've actually recruited, and it looks great, but actually when you drill into that, as I say, the retention figures are shocking. It's as simple as that. So it's not just encouraging people to start up a job, it's actually to pursue that career longer term. And so, but again, and it's probably going to sound very repetitious, but it still comes down to ensuring people have putting quality of life at the heart of those professions, ensuring that holistic approach in all elements of that enables people to actually pursue those careers in the long term. And I fundamentally believe, I think my core of that is ensuring that people can be in those communities where they're delivering those services, so they can understand them and they can tailor those services to where they need to be. And that includes everyone all the way up to the really senior managers who are making some really fundamental operational decisions, so they can understand the impact that's going to have on the ground. So I think it's probably quite a broad and quite nuanced answer, but that's probably would be my perspective on it.
Thank you, Shaun. Just following up on something Shaun said there, Paul, Shaun's emphasised a holistic approach. Do you think that we do have a habit of underestimating how important it is to have key workers embedded in the communities that they're serving? I mean, what do we lose when we don't have that?
I think part of the problem that we have is we're prepared to watch decline over a decade or so and just fiddle around the edges of it, and then we expect recovery overnight. And we can't have recovery overnight if we're simply shipping people in to do a really short-term job to hit some really quick numerical indicators, and then they ship out to go and do the repair somewhere else. So that doesn't, in answer to your question, embed people into the local area. And therefore, I say what we need to do for that is to, yes, you've got to get the incentives right for people to go there, and you've got to get the housing right, and you've got to get the salary right. But you've also got to set up a situation where people can be proud of the work that they're doing over the longer term, and they see them staying there. When they make the decision to go, they see their career being there in the longer term, and that their career will be safe in the longer term. So I know of head teachers who have taken a risky appointment because it needed some work and have ended up negotiating their way out of that job because the indicators haven't moved quite as quickly as you'd like them to. But that gets into a very destructive inspection system that invites intervention more quickly than you can achieve recovery. So I think as much as money, it's about a sense of support, a sense of assurance that going to do a job is the right thing to do in the most difficult areas, and from that you'll get some pride, and I think it's that sense of pride as much as anything else that will keep people in the local area.
Thank you. Richard, Paul's spoken about the importance that making sure these professions, they have a sense of pride, there's status, they have a strong role in the community. I mean, is that something that government can fix quickly at speed? I mean, what do you think that's deliverable in the next few years?
I think it can help, but I think one of the issues that's it's a bit of one of the things that Shaun and I look at all the time in our role on the Public Accounts Committee is actually how well you spend public money, and the idea that you're constantly churning through people is probably one of the largest wastes of public money that you can possibly see. So I think it's taking an approach which actually reflects that. I think David's right when he says, about there are issues in schools in my area. My two of my big secondary schools, which serve my constituents, are require improvement, and that's and they are getting new teaching in, and there are issues, but there are the systemic long-term issues there. A lot of it is around recruitment and retention, but more so recruitment of good teachers who want to stay there for the long term. There is a broader package around that, as Shaun suggests, around local communities and people wanting to feel that they live there, clearly wanting to be part of it. But I don't think it's not all just about money. There are lots of drivers. There are lots of drivers to it, but the biggest one, I think, is anything around making retention key, and actually rewarding that. I don't think that's necessarily either just by having fixed national pay spines, either where you tick up every year. I'm not against that on a fundamental level, but is that the best way of doing it? Is it the best way of retaining people? That I don't know. Maybe there are different local solutions, as David suggested, for some of these communities, which could be looked at. What I want to see is good staff maintained in our public sector, and that's what I think we need to be focused on, rather than necessarily the current or historic mechanisms that we've used. And also on the flip side, on governments trying to drive towards shiny targets for numbers of extra people as well.
Thank you, Richard. I'd just like to open this up to the floor. If there's anyone who has a question, but maybe just before we do that, so we've got a bit of time, I've just got another question of my own. Dean, what role does immigration have to play in solving recruitment and retention issues in key public services? How important is it?
Well, if you take the NHS in the long run, immigration has always been part of the workforce.
Yeah.
But if you look forward and you look at the shortages that are if you look at what's happening in medicine and health across the world generally, the radiography crisis or the midwifery crisis that we have in the NHS is actually being replicated around the world. What's happening, the science behind radiography is extraordinary. So that's partly what's driving this. So we have to recognise that in some of these key professions, we are in a global marketplace, and therefore you need a system in place that recognises and allows the British public services to compete in that global marketplace. And what we have at the moment is the complete opposite. We've seen 148% growth in overseas recruitment in radiography between 2015 and 2020. That has now entirely evaporated in the last 2 years. So the forecasts, which were already extraordinarily ambitious for what we needed to do to meet the demand and meet the expectation, are now unachievable unless we can turn that around. And there is no system in place, and currently no coordinated national conversation and no targeted resource specifically for that. So by the time we get round to having the conversation, we'll have already have sunk. So some of this, we have to get rid of the dogma behind the language that's driving some of this stuff. The other thing about, just to come back in on, I think it also sits in on what kind of a place it is, right? What kind of a workplace and what kind of communities are we inviting people in? And I think there is a sociological dialogue we need to have and a perspective on this. I think over the last 4 decades, there's been a gap has opened up, what I call the public value gap, between the way that, when I was a kid, the way that teachers were looked at in communities, the way that health professionals were looked at, versus the way that they're now talked about and looked at now. Right? When I was a kid, I grew up in a new town in South Wales, a post-war new town that was being literally built. Every kid in my class had at least one parent, at least one who worked in either the two engineering plants or the steelworks that the town was being built around. And the town's only middle class were teachers and health professionals. Now, those engineering plants and steelworks have gone, and the biggest employer in the community by a country mile is the new hospital. Recognising the economic importance and the economic centrality of the NHS and the public services, recognising that wins you the argument for the necessary long-term strategic investment that is missing, gets rid of all of this short-termism and allows health managers to start planning their recruitment in a 3, 4, 5-year cycle rather than a 6-month cycle, which it is at the moment, which is also, and apart from Brexit and we look like a country that doesn't like foreign people anymore, one of the biggest problems with recruiting overseas staff is it takes longer. And it takes too long, and if you're being paid, the money you get is on a 6th monthly cycle. So if you're the health manager, you have to recruit on a 6th monthly cycle, and you know it takes you 9 months to recruit somebody from overseas, you can't even bother trying. The system needs to be more joined up, more strategic, less short term, and we just need to be more positive about the importance economically and socially, and just nicer about it, you know? New schools, when I was a kid, if you built a new school, it came with a caretaker's house. What happened to those? That said something about the value of caretakers. If you built a hospital, it came with an accommodation block for new staff to move into the community and live in, so they got a start and could start their careers. When did that stop happening? These things have not happened by design, but you're going to need to find your way out of it by design. And that is definitely where government come into this.
Thank you, Dean. Shaun, do you think it's a fair comment that Britain comes across as a country that doesn't like foreign people? And how can we shift that perception, if you think that there is the case, and get more people to come here and work in our public services?
So I would certainly say for the communities I represent that is definitely not the case at all. Speaking more broadly, I think we've got a tradition and a history of welcoming everyone here, and whatever, and this has always been, this country's always been one where if you wanted to pursue your dreams, you could do that. It was, and I do not think, despite what we may have seen over the last couple of years, I don't think that spirit has gone at all. And certainly if you come into my communities, they would welcome you with open arms wherever you were from. So in terms of that, I don't agree that is the case. I think more broadly, in terms of, you asked about sort of shifting perceptions, I think really there's a broader issue here, which is, it's to shift that perception, and I think perhaps that perception's been built on more sort of division in communities themselves, which is sort of leaked out. It's about fundamentally bringing those communities back together and doing the things that we've talked about today through enhanced public services, through rebuilding that sense of home and community, through sort of reigniting those conversations and bring people out of it, and areas that we consider left behind, feeling that they're actually realising they've got that recognition and that respect again. So I think it's an interesting question, but with probably quite a really broad answer. In that, actually, I think there's a lot of other issues that underpin perhaps that perception that we need to deal with. But I don't, the premise that we're not welcoming to people from outside, I would disagree with. I think we all know within our own communities that that's just simply not the case. And we know every day we encounter, we deal with, we have people in our lives that are from entirely different backgrounds, from other walks of life, from other countries, and I don't think that that really is the case. But in terms of shifting that perception, I think ultimately we've got to look inwards in terms of our communities as they are at the moment, and whatever it is that's causing that, we've got to deal with it. And I think fundamentally, as I say, it's the things we've been talking about. It's public services, it's community, it's wages, giving people that sense of value. And in deindustrialised areas like mine, it's finding that purpose for our community again, which I think we are doing. But I think that's going to be the big way that we we ensure we can perhaps shift that.
Thank you, Shaun. If we can open this out to the floor. Yes, I have a question here. Can I just ask that everyone waits until they have a mic before they begin speaking, just for the sake of the live stream?
Thank you. I'm from the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. I just wanted to ask a question in relation to NHS contracts. So currently for physiotherapy, it's a very popular subject, and we've got a really healthy supply of physios coming through universities, but they're not being capitalised. That's not being capitalised on by the NHS, which feels like a really wasted opportunity given how much physios as part of the rehab workforce is so needed. And in the long-term plan, there was a floating of an idea of offering contracts to graduates, nursing graduates, which feels like could be a real possibility to attract physios certainly into the NHS as the start of their career. And my other question was about thoughts on the NHS in terms of paying conditions and how that influences the private sector and sort of sectors outside of the NHS, because as the biggest employer, that's something we see in physiotherapy, that actually the paying conditions in the rest of in other sectors actually follows the NHS. So it's sort of a levelling up in reality.
Thank you. Dean, would you like to come in on that? Certainly on that first question.
I think there's a couple of things that you've hit on there that I think any of the allied health professions would recognise. I think the last point about the capture of aspects of the professionals by the private sector is a really interesting one, of where it's not about needing more money, it's about spending the money that's in the system well and joining the system up. So radiography has a similar problem. We have a massive shortage of reporting radiographers and really no pay incentive. The amount of overtime our members work at band 6 means they were paid above the pay rate for the minimum of the band above. So there's no real pay incentive to get promotion. They can earn the same amount but do less hours by going to work in the private sector, who then charge the NHS a small fortune, and the NHS has no option but to pay the small fortune because it can't keep and retain enough staff to deliver it themselves. So there's a cycle there that needs to be broken, and because that's wasted resource. That's what worries me about the breakdown of national pay framework, or there not being enough. I think there does need to be more flexibility. I think there does need to be more creativity in the system, particularly around some of those marginal things like I've suggested around paying off student loans if people go to work in hard to fill areas, pension breaks instead of pension increases, for again potentially targeted at people who go and work to stay in harder to fill areas. For GPs, that would definitely be something that I know people are interested in. So those and those softer things that say if you work in the NHS, our green transport plan that we're developing, if we could find a sponsor, the government could help us with this, a car manufacturer looking to push green vehicles, who said if you work in the NHS, you can get a 20% discount on top of an interest-free loan that we'll give you to buy an electric car. That has all sorts of benefits and gains, both in real terms for those people, but also in softer psychological terms. It shifts the balance on the public value gap. But a lot of the private sector stuff, there's a capture of the marketplace. And the other way you started with, again, every allied health profession will tell you this gap between the number of people coming through in training versus the jobs. If there's no connection and there's no joined up connection between how many people a region needs, not just a trust by trust or hospital by hospital, which is where competition gets you if you're not careful, but regionally, if there's no strategy that's joined up to the number of people training and they haven't got a job to come to at the end, you have to relocate. That's mad. And there was also another option there that health has been behind on. If you look at education, I trained as a teacher in the early 90s. That was my first area. It was all done through the universities, all done through PGCEs. Since then, earn to train and earn to learn schemes have come into social work and education. They barely anywhere in health. That's also something that I think we need to really, really look at and can work jointly with the government on if we're serious. But again, these are long-term plans, and at the moment, everything in health financially works on a 6-month to yearly cycle.
Thank you, Dean. If I could just follow that up with Richard. I mean, would you like to see a cohesive strategy that creates a pipeline so that you have graduates leaving university and getting essentially put on these pathways that sees them get jobs in key public sectors that perhaps have recruitment issues?
I'm happy with that. I think there needs to be a broader look at actually how we train. We probably have to look at how we train many different people in the public sector as well. I know that the teaching unions will be probably quite against any form of degree apprenticeship. But I think that's. I don't have an issue with that. I think you could definitely look at that, trying to push that even harder in nursing. I think there are definite routes in with that. I don't see the benefits of not doing that. I just wanted to pick up on the immigration point, which was made before as well. I do think we need to be careful that we're not sort of exporting our failure to train and recruit as many people as we should do in the UK by constantly relying on importing doctors and nurses and other professionals from overseas. I think there is a clear failure in our system if we can't recruit enough people here. That doesn't mean we shouldn't also allow excellent people from around the world to come. I did think though that there's an important point made earlier on about look how we value, and again this is sort of with the Public Accounts Committee ahead on a little bit, just around the sort of caretakers and the accommodation block. I'm absolutely certain that in your PFI contract, for many institutions, it will be a lot cheaper to have 3 people who lived on site, or one person who potentially lived on site all the time, and then had a couple of people who came in occasionally from a small local contractor doing things, rather than them being outsourced to private firms, although it might seem initially, or it might have looked initially beneficial to do that. I think we need to take a clearer, more holistic approach on when we're looking at those sorts of contracts, and also the incentives for people, because I think there is pride in doing a good job in our public services. I think that one of the reasons people join the army is not for the incredible rates of pay or work in our NHS, rather than going into banking or whatever, is not for the incredible rates of pay, but it's to do something broader, and they need to be valued within that. And I think there are lots of, and I think, but coming to the actual sort of question, is the roots in. I'm all in favour of more roots in, but I think that needs to be, we need to be flexible about those roots in, and to be open-minded about them as well. And I think that in some cases, sometimes some of the unions do push back on some of those roots in unnecessarily in order to try and defend something which I don't think is actually. I think it's a bit of a Potemkin defence for some reasons.
Thank you, Richard. Just opening it back up to the floor. I think we have a question. Yes, we could just wait for the mic to come down.
Hi, Ryan Shorthouse from Bright Blue. 2 questions from me. The first is basically around public services which may not be regulated by a kind of pay framework. So I'm thinking about childcare markets, social care markets, where people, they are public services in a way, but most of the work is being done by private, voluntary or independent providers. Obviously, the regulation of pay is much harder there. What can we do really to kind of boost pay and conditions in those types of public services? And particularly thinking about the impact of immigration. What will that do in terms of reduced immigration on pay and conditions in those areas? The second question I have is around quality, and there is good evidence that better qualified staff can improve outcomes, for example, in education. So how can we attract the most talented people into some of the so-called left behind areas? We at Bright Blue have been talking about salary supplements, which the government have introduced in part, for example, for teachers in science and maths in particular areas. But can we extend that further and think about how we can get the most talented people into the hardest to reach areas where outcomes are poorer? Might not just be a financial incentive. There may be other incentives. What are they? to really kind of get that distribution of talent in public services where, you know, the outcomes are poor at the moment.
Thank you, Ryan. Shaun, would you like to comment on Ryan's first question?
Yeah, I think at the core of it is an issue around recognition. So in those sectors that Ryan mentioned there, in terms of particularly care workers, and thinking also childcare, areas like that is say unregulated. I think there's the key thing there, I think, is around recognising perhaps the importance of these roles that we haven't necessarily seen until I think the pandemic's really opened an eye on. I am open to the fact there needs to be a really broad conversation as to how we really do look into this. I mean, I know in my own patch, the stories I've had from care workers who are working ridiculous structures, ridiculous hours for very little pay and recognition, and it's ultimately pushing them to the point where they don't want to be part of that anymore, and so we're then struggling as a result. So there clearly does, I'm not averse to the idea of there being a conversation that involves government around this and how we ensure that we improve these structures and give that, I think, certainty that people in the sector really want to keep people incentivised to stay within those roles. I also think it's a broader conversation around culture as well. I think perhaps what we've seen in many of the roles at times is there's been a degree of effectively putting them down. And actually what we need to do, and I'm thinking of, and I think it's the care sector I think of predominantly, is actually showing those pathways as careers ultimately, and showing those roles not just as sort of jobs that you take, but careers you can pursue and that you can build a life off. Because the retention issue that I think for me comes at the heart of that question in terms of how we deal with that, I think it's changing the culture and the perception of these roles to then enable us to have a really broader conversation around pay, around conditions, around incentivisation, and getting the industry on board with that. I think, certainly from my experience, from the providers I've spoken to in my own constituency, there is a willingness to engage on that, and there's a willingness to have those conversations. But ultimately, for me, I think the key around that, as I say, is recognition and status. I think if we can get that conversation shifted, I think it's going to open the door for anyone then trying to have a broader conversation around how we improve this and give the certainty that I think the sector's looking for.
Thank you. Would you like to comment, Dean?
Yeah, just on those two areas. First of all, let's not make any mistake. Childcare isn't unregulated. It's unstructured, but it's massively regulated. What we've seen in areas like childcare and social care is a massive market failure. It's been left to organise itself structurally, and public money has gone into it without any thought of how that's being organised. And it's not necessarily how much money is in the system, it's how that's being spent, how much of it's going on profits to the person who's putting up and organising it, as opposed to putting standards in that regulate and support how people are getting paid. They're also, by coincidence, massively under-unionised. And I think that would help if there was some incentives and support and encouragement from everybody across the piece, see the positive role that unions can play, and I think are playing in most of the public sectors, as we showed over COVID. That would help. So I think it's something about how that money is. It's about showing that cares and making sure that when you're giving out contracts, there are things like what are people earning. And if you want quality teaching and you want quality social care, don't exhaust the staff. Don't allow 50, 60-hour-week contracts to be pushed through. Apply the regulation. The regulation's there. Put some money into policing it and say, if you're exhausting your staff and they're working 60 hours, you don't get another contract, because pay them properly. And if that means we have to increase the cost of it overall, I think the public will be willing to pay that if they can see the quality in return. But if you pay rubbish and you get rubbish, it's almost as if the country's run on a kind of only fools and horses basis, whereas people might actually pay a bit more tax if they thought they were getting something decent back for it.
Thank you, Dean. David, I'd like to come to you if I can. So Dean says that child and social care represent a massive market failure as they currently stand. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think successive governments have allowed that situation to develop?
I think the point that Richard made about a broader systemic failure that, frankly, the economic system we've relied on for the past 40 years has failed to skill enough people up domestically, has relied in too many sectors on paying people too little, hasn't given people enough dignity at work, enough status, enough scope for progression as well. I think that's something important to talk about when we talk about retention. If a career has no progression and no status and no dignity, then how do we expect to retain people in those circumstances? And I thought actually the Prime Minister's interview in Andrew Marr this morning was really profoundly important for a Conservative Prime Minister to say that in 2016 people pretty clearly voted that the model which said there was a reliance on low pay, low skill could no longer go on. And we're seeing this in various sectors, that there is a need to improve people's pay, a need to improve people's conditions and their dignity as well. I wouldn't actually disagree with the point about unionisation either. I made the point in the book that there are several sectors, care sector is one, call centre workers is another, where people haven't been able to organise, where there's little to no representation at work. I think partially that's a failure of the trade union movement, where for many people who would most benefit from trade unions don't even consider being represented at work. And I think that's another discussion we have to have about our economic model. How can you make sure that people feel represented at work and kind of have power in the workplace as well? And frankly, without what happened in 2016, I don't think we'd be having these discussions. I think that clear revolt about the way the economic model was working and was just not working for so many people is really important as a kind of guiding force behind these debates. And I think it's profoundly heartwarming this is happening at a Tory party conference and being driven by a Tory Prime Minister.
Thank you, David. Let's come to you, Richard. I mean, both David and Dean have talked about how unionisation in particular sectors, care sector, centre workers, childcare sector, could help solve some of these problems or get a conversation going. Do you agree with that? Is that what we need to see?
I'm not against unionisation at all. I think tradition in the UK, we've had some parts of the world have worked where you've seen employers work well with unions. Traditionally, that's not always been the case in the UK, but it is in some sectors in the UK. You go into the aerospace industry, BAE Systems have great working relationships. I've worked well recently with the Prison Officers Union on. We did a private members bill. I took it over from Cheryl Giller when she was very ill to ban some psychoactive substances in prisons where people, in enhanced drugs testing, which actually to make the workplace, particularly for those prison officers, better. I don't think there is a natural, it depends, our Labour Party emerged as the parliamentary wing of the trade union movement. There is some part of that which naturally causes friction with perhaps with the Conservative Party. I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case. I think, and I don't think that the unions are naturally home to the most left-wing people ever. Traditionally, they were actually generally the centre-right of the Labour movement. I think there's one of the things I just wanted to pick up again on what David said about immigration and what the Prime Minister said earlier today. I don't know if you remember, like I do, there's a one question time where there was a woman who lived in London, strongly Remain, who said, where are we going to get all the people? Where are we going to get all the people to work in prep from if we stop it, right? If we leave the European Union? That, to me, is a real problem with an attitude to immigration. That's the same attitude that you'll find from the same people when they talk about social care, and they talk about childcare, and they talk about healthcare assistance. And it's a real problem, and if you want to talk about, we talk about paying conditions, but we want to talk about also respect and pride. Then there's also that needs to be considered in that. Yeah. On childcare, there are huge issues there, and it's actually I think one of the biggest. That and social care are two of the real issues, particularly around employment at the moment. But I've got friends who are now saying, well, we can't afford to go back to work. Childcare costs are huge. There are some issues which need to be discussed with the probably with the teaching unions, around, if I'm a qualified teacher, I can look after, I think it's 15 4-year-olds, but if I'm not, then I can look after 8. Yet, if in a primary school I can look after 30, there are really difficult dynamics around that which need to be dealt with. I think there is a role for, particularly for the sort of 3 to 5-year-olds, in looking at those ratios, particularly if we can actually upskill the profession in childcare. But again, it's what do we want from childcare? If we're wanting them to be taught, then that's one thing. I don't want to see every 3-year-old starting to be taught. I remember my primary school vaguely remember my primary school first couple of years, and there was not a lot of, it wasn't very teacher heavy or teaching heavy, and I certainly don't think it needs to be in preschool either. I think we can look at some of those things. I think we need to have an honest conversation about them, because if not, those costs of childcare aren't going to change. And in order to try and keep the costs down, even though they're still extortionate, because they are just very expensive, then we're going to end up in the same cycle. So we're going to need to have a look at that, and first of all, how we value the workforce. Secondly, what we want the workforce to do, and thirdly, have an honest conversation about what differences that's going to mean in terms of ratios of children and those other issues more broadly.
Thank you, Richard. Before I go to my next question, we got anyone who'd like to? Yes, this gentleman. If you could just pause until you have the mic. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I work for Sue Ryder. We're a national charity. We have neurological centres and hospices, bereavement care as well. I'm a doctor, and at the start of the pandemic, it was very scary working in a hospice. We had no access to the PPE that was in the hospitals. It does feel now that we are thought of as part of the system, that we all rely on each other. I just wonder if there's a view on the panel about supporting charities. Pre-pandemic, a fifth of hospices were facing huge financial crises, and the government has bailed out the hospice industry, but increasingly now we rely on fundraising events and selling second-hand goods to look after dying people. I wonder if the panel has a view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Shaun, can I give that to you?
Yeah. So it's a difficult one, because clearly it's got to be part of this broader discussion, isn't it, that we've talked about. And I think again what we're seeing now in terms of the policy direction is, I think whereas in the past we've perhaps shied away from a policy perspective of talking about these things and how we're actually going to fund particularly longer term care and more complex care and needs. Clearly, again, there is going to need to be some sort of conversation, intervention from government in terms of what that looks like. I don't know what that looks like. I think that's, again, probably a conversation between colleagues in DHSE, Treasury, but I also think, again, particularly when we're thinking about this space, there's the broader needs that are there as well. So we've talked about it a bit more in terms of ensuring that there are places for people to live, with more, there's a support there. There's buy-in from things such as local authorities, from people that are delivering services on the ground as well. So I think from my perspective, in terms of answering the question, sort of on that sort of longer term point, I would say there's got to be a discussion within government, and I think there's going to have to be some sort of, there's got to be some sort of pragmatism, a proactive approach as to how government addresses these issues. What that looks like, I wouldn't be able to say, but I think from a policy perspective, the willingness to intervene when there clearly is a problem and clearly is an issue, I think is something that the government has demonstrated so far. And I think as part of this new approach and this realisation that we've talked about before, I think it's something that we're going to have to carry on through. So I think to round off my comment, I'd just say there's going to have to be an intervention of some form or other.
Thank you. If I can just also follow that up with Richard, perhaps. I mean, the pandemic's been really hard on charities, and we're still relying on them to perform some really vital services, as this gentleman's question shows. I mean, what is the government doing about that incoming crisis?
I think charities have huge amounts of roles and actually do immense amounts of good across society in a way in which, if the state was to intervene, the dead hand of the state, as much as the sort of invisible hand of the market, aren't necessarily what anybody's after in some of these provisions. Charities can deliver that specialised local care. I think of Willowburn Hospice in my constituency, in a way that if I genuinely gave it over to the to a state actor, I don't think it would provide it in the same personalised way. I don't have an answer to this, but I would say I just wanted to make an observation. Really, medically, we spend a huge amount of resources on people in their first year of life and their last year of life, and that to me. And yet we talk about those first few years after birth, and we're talking about childcare a lot today, and that sector, and those few years perhaps before people's death in, elderly adult social care settings. Yet we don't spend anywhere near those level of resources in those spaces. And I just wonder if we've got our prioritisation a little wrong in desperately medicating the end of life in some ways. My grandmother died last year in a medical setting. My other grandmother has very advanced dementia and lives at home with my dad, who's a full-time carer used to be a secondary school teacher, and and it's pretty tough. But that level of care that she gets could not be delivered it just couldn't be delivered by any form of other institution. Part of it has got to be the way we look after each other within our families, I think, is also important, and the way we look after each other in communities. It's one of the things that we do with childcare all the time, and one of the things we traditionally did with our parents as well. But I think we have to have a broader look at. I know actually, the leader of the opposition said we need to have a look at mental health care in his speech. I think and look at that more broadly. I think we need to have ask some broader questions about what we do in terms of those first years of life and last years of life within both the education setting, but also the the health setting as well. And are we actually doing the right things in those things, particularly medicating the end of life?
Thank you, Richard.
Just very quickly, I think hospice is a really interesting example of this problem that's been happening a lot over a long period of time. And that's the national insurance, which is in the news a lot recently, came in as part of Beveridge with the phrase cradle to grave. And what's happened over the last 3 decades, probably, systematically, is when something's got a bit difficult, it's dropped off. The state stopped taking any responsibility for it. It's just been, that's a bit tough, we'll do that over there. We talked about nurseries and childcare. We wanted nursery and childcare, weren't prepared to pay for it, so we hived it off, laid it over there. We're getting to the point now where we need to be asking the right questions and bringing some of this back and asking some pretty fundamental questions about what sort of society we want to be and where that cradle to grave picture stands in amongst all of that. And I think charities are part of the solution. I worked for NAPO before coming to work, the probation union, before coming to work for the SOR. That's a really good example. Charities were working with the probation service on a local basis, providing some incredibly nuanced but incredibly important part of the solution. The transformation of rehabilitation revolution came along. Like all revolutions, it ended in tragedy and failure and heartache and a counter-revolution, which I'm glad to say I was part of organising. But charities were run out of that system, and where we are in probation now is we've got a nationalised probation service. So the Conservative government nationalised what was a localised service where charities were fundamentally part of the delivery, and charities are really struggling to get back engaged. And the probation service still has some of those links, but they can't get the money to the people on the ground locally who need it to deliver those kind of services. So we've got to start asking some fundamental questions. And if you ask the right question, you might get the wrong answer. You might get the right answer. If you don't ask the right question, you'll never find the right answer.
Thank you, Dean. I've got a question for Paul. So there's been discussion about how left behind areas, they struggle to attract professionals such as teachers. But from the other sort of way of looking at it, I mean, to what extent is it the case that poor retention of professionals like teachers can actually lead to an area becoming left behind, to the decline of a community?
Well, it's either virtuous or vicious circles, isn't it? So yes, if you're not retaining enough people, then where will the openings be? Where will the jobs that aren't filled be? And that's going to be in the least attractive areas. So absolutely, one feeds the other. But I think just reflecting on all of the debate so far around this, we keep coming back to, we haven't spoken about it in these terms, but we keep coming back to how much are we prepared to spend and what's the debate between value and quality. And I'm really encouraged by some of the words Richard's using about the value of engaging with trade unions and the value of looking at different routes into education or routes into other professions. But I think there's a trust deficit somewhere as well that we need to get over, because the resistance to some of those other routes in is because we just don't trust where they lead to, and actually kind of a devaluing of professional status, a devaluing of the jobs is where we are. So if we're going to take those other routes, we need to look at that. And then some of the debates around pay regulation, and there was a hint towards regional pay, I think, in some of your commentary, Richard, as well, which is that the beauty of national regulation around pay. It can accommodate those regional differences with things like large town allowances. I used to negotiate years ago in a different life, and London waiting and things like that. So you can deal with it, but it means that your profession is portable financially as well as in terms of the skills that you have to go into those other difficult areas too. So I think what we've actually got to boil it down to, and even the stuff around where charities are, and I don't lay this at the door of a Conservative government, because it started under the last Labour administration, which is expecting charities to step in where the state has retreated. And I see the impact of charity as being as well as but not instead of, and how do we get that right? So I think Richard, you're right. We need a debate actually about, do we want to provide everything we used to, or do we provide different? What's the cost of that, and how do we then deal with it? And that's a hugely difficult debate, and I don't think any of the major political parties have had sufficient confidence to take that on, and that's when we therefore get into those really destructive polarised debates, which we haven't had here today. When you get into the thoughtful debates about this stuff, I think we can begin to pick out some answers, and for me therefore is, how do we get out of the polarised debate that is so destructive and just so nasty.
Thank you, Paul. Have we got any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, I've got a question for David. You spoke about your hope that the levelling up agenda can deliver, I think you said, profound change. Are you impressed with the progress that's been made thus far? Obviously, in the context of the pandemic.
I am. I'm also impressed. It's clearly a governmental priority. I think there's two elements. One, there is the social, the economic, and the moral imperative that we have to turn around communities that have been ignored for a long, long time. We're talking 30, 40, 50 years of neglect from government of different parties. We're talking about giving people back hope within their community. We're talking about rebuilding good quality jobs and good quality town centres and great infrastructure, so that people who grow up somewhere don't have to leave if they want to pursue certain careers. So that people can live a really high quality life in their local area, and you have a real sense of place, a sense of worth in local areas. And the second point, we're a Tory party conference, so let's talk about the politics for a little bit, is that we won an 80-seat majority because of places like North West Durham. And I think we must complete this agenda and drive it forward. And I think without driving forward this agenda, it's very difficult to see a political coalition the Conservatives can pull together to win an 80-seat majority. So it's really important that we show progress between now and the next election in terms of town centres should be better. There should be some momentum behind infrastructure and some momentum in terms of people's wage packets. But people in places like Concert, they're not expecting a miracle. They're not expecting things to happen overnight, but they want to see things moving in the right direction. And the number of people I speak to who said it's great to hear a government really talking about listening to us and turning the place round. And I think this is, as I say, one of the most important missions that any government has taken on since the Second World War. And if we get it right, which I think we will, it will have an enormously positive difference in so many people's lives. And I think it's really, really crucial that this is part of the major part, as I say, of the conference agenda so far.
Thank you, David. We've had a question through from the audience. Thank you, Simon, for via live stream. Thank you, Simon, for your question. I think I'll give this to Shaun and then ask Richard to come in on it as well. Are the Conservative Party now the party of workers after the 2019 election?
I think we always have been the party of workers, in my perspective, really. As you know, someone from what would probably be described as a very traditional working class background, I mean, I would always say that we probably have been in terms of what you class those priorities to be. I mean, for me, I think it's always been the core of around aspiration and talking to workers' aspiration, and that idea that we want to give people that opportunity to push on and move forward. So I think that we always have been. I think perhaps how we go about helping people to realise those aspirations has changed. For the better, we'll definitely see. I think, as I say, I think the levelling up agenda being a key part of that. I mean, I know a lot of people have sort of framed it at times as the Conservative Party becoming a lot more interventionist, a lot more big state. But actually, I think part of that has been actually about allowing communities to realise their aspirations and the workers within those communities to realise their aspirations, which to me has always been sort of a fundamental tenet of the party, really. So I think we always have been. I just think perhaps we're doing things in a slightly different way, and certainly for my communities, maybe a better way for them. So, yeah.
Thank you, Shaun. Do you agree with that, Richard? Has the Conservative Party actually always been the party of workers?
I don't know if it's always been the party of workers, but I think there's definitely one nation traditions that go back a very long way within the Conservative Party. You could certainly say that actually, in essence, the Conservative Party was born out of a struggle between the landed aristocracy and the workers over a repeal of the Corn Laws, when the first modern manifesto was actually put forwards, and in doing so, Peel shattered what had been the old Tory coalition back in the 1830s. I think David and I have a lot in common because of the nature of my seat, and the fact that he's from that area. I think I almost think will the real victory in levelling up be when the Labour Party or whichever centre left party emerges as the opposition over time, it basically adopts the same sort of agenda. Both main parties adopted for the North East, in concert from the Second World War to the late 70s for 40 years, a sort of subsidising slow decline of industry. Then they both adopted, one after the other in a different way, a sort of subsidised stagnation to a degree for the next 30 years. And then we're seeing levelling up coming in. I think there's a real chance there for those areas to change fundamentally and to deliver that real opportunity. And I'd like to even go further than what David suggests, because David says, it's not, and this is the sort of mantra at the moment, it's not about, you don't have to leave to get on. I want some people to go and find work elsewhere, but I also want people to come to Concert and come to the West Midlands and the Black Country as well in Shaun's patch. I don't want it to be seen as a place where people emigrate from. I see it as part of that dynamic economy where people move in and out of. And that will actually help address some of the bigger issues we've been talking around today, around health and education, and having people wanting to move there as well and to be part of that. So I think it's almost bringing the country up to a level where parts of the country, like North West Durham, are on that same level as other places which see people come and go, but there are strong communities are maintained, rather than it being an area constantly in a perpetual battle against decline.
Thank you, Richard. David, do you want to come in?
Just a very quick point about the Workers' Party point. It's just the fact we're in Manchester, and just over there, I think, the Free Trade Hall is where Disraeli gave that wonderful speech, where he said, "I'm convinced that the working man is by nature conservative," and set out a huge number of social reforms by which the Tory Party help the working class elevate the condition of the people. So I think being in Manchester is a very, very notable place to talk about the Tories being the Workers' Party, and the fact we always have been at our best.
Thank you, David. Paul, if you'd like to...
I couldn't let this question go and not have a trade union official address it somewhere along the line. And I lead a fiercely politically independent trade union, by the way. We're not affiliated at all. And clearly more workers voted for you last time round than they did when we had a Labour government. So by that measure, you're currently the party of the worker. But I'd say to you that those votes that got you there this time round are on loan rather than you've got the freehold of them so far. And what I think the Conservative Party has done over the last couple of years, when we've been through tremendous political change and tremendous social strife, is you've been able to reassure people with slogans right now, and they're very pithy slogans, which are great, and I'm good at those as a trade union official when we're campaigning. The trick's going to come with delivery, and I think for whatever reason, I'm not going to get into the reasons for this now, but over this weekend, I spent a day yesterday trying to fill up with petrol to get to here. When I went shopping yesterday, there were empty shelves in the shops that we went to. You hear moans about people not being able to get an appointment at their GP. Waiting lists in hospitals are growing. So those workers are the users of those services, and workers are the people that will want to see that improve if you can keep hold of their votes. So you've made them a promise. You better deliver on it, otherwise I think you're going to struggle to really secure yourself as the party of the worker.
Thank you, Paul.
Can I just come back on that very briefly?
Sure.
I just, and I 100% I actually agree with Paul, right? And I think both him and David are saying exactly the same thing in a way, which is that there might have been some progress, but there's a long way to go, right? And there's got and those votes are on loan. And believe me, right? I'm an 1100 seat, I'm an 1100 majority in a seat which had a 25,000 Labour majority in 1997, right? And has never been Conservative before. Shaun's in a similar place. One of the things I would say over the last couple of years is we have delivered some part of that. We've delivered support through furlough and through other uplifts across the board, which have been unprecedented by a government of any colour. And I think part of the down payment on that, and part of the reason that the government has enjoyed consistently higher levels of support, is that people have recognised that this is a different sort of Conservative Party, because I don't think you'd have seen a Conservative Party, or in fact a new Labour Party, having put that level of support in to support jobs.
Thank you, Richard. Well, that is where we will come to a close. Thank you so much to the audience for being here and to asking your questions, also to those watching on the live stream. Also, thank you very much to our panellists, and especially to Unions 21 for partnering with us